There is much to discuss, so let's get to our panel. Joining us from Damascus is Mohamad Ali. He is a Syrian-based journalist for Press TV. From Istanbul, we're joined by Yusuf Alabarda. He is a retired officer of the Turkish Armed Forces and is now an expert in international security. With us from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is a journalist and a Russian political analyst. And with me right here in the studio is Edmund Ghareeb. He is a Middle East scholar and analyst. Welcome to all of you to the show. Mohamad Ali, let me start with you in Damascus. The Syrian military has pushed into areas around Aleppo. It seems the goal is to remove the last remaining rebels from that area. How much of a turning point this in ending this war? As we've just said, this is a war that's been going on for 9 years.
Well, yes, definitely. This is a very significant military operation for the Syrian army. Now, the reason is that every time the Syrian army gets closer and closer to the borderline with Turkey, this means that the terrorists will be defeated eventually at the end of the day. So the more the army gets closer to the borderline, the more terrorists will be actually defeated. Because at the end of the day, this is where the armed groups are getting all of the support they need. It is from the borderline, it is from Turkey, and this is clearly clear for the Syrian army at the end of the day. Even Turkey is sending reinforcements and assisting the armed groups on the ground in the fight against the Syrian army. Actually, every time there's a counterattack by the terrorists on the ground, we see the Turkish artillery and tanks assisting them in attacking the Syrian army. So it's a very crucial and important battle for the Syrian army. The Syrian Army Command issued a statement recently saying that it has liberated all of the towns and villages in the northwest and western countryside of Aleppo, which means for the first time in 2012, Aleppo now is secure and there will be no more terrorist mortar attacks on the city. And we have been seeing how hundreds of people and thousands have been taken to the streets in Aleppo celebrating that. Now, let me bring you the latest, which is very important. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad just came on a televised speech, and he gave some very powerful statements. And he said, and I quote, "The battle for liberating Idlib and Aleppo countryside will continue regardless of empty bubbles," as he said, coming from the north, meaning Turkey, and that the battle for liberating all of Syrian territories and squashing terrorists will continue.
Okay. Yusuf Alabarda, there we just heard that Turkey is supporting armed groups in that area around Aleppo. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he says that the Turkish military will drive back Syrian forces. So what does Turkey make of this latest Syrian offensive?
Yeah, okay, if you have a hammer in your hand, you will see all the world as a nail. For this reason, I do not think that the Syrian Arab army is fighting against terrorism, because when you get out these ruins that the Syrian army has been bombed, the city of Aleppo, Hama, Homs, Dera, you will see the innocent women, ladies, children, schools, kids, everything is under the ground. So we can see now that 23 million of the Syrian population, almost 50% is living in another place where they were born. 4 million of them is living inside Turkey. 1 million of them is living inside Lebanon. 1 million is living inside the European Union. 500,000 of them has been killed. So if you categorize all those people, the 50% of the Syrian population means terrorists, according to the Assad and to his speaking mouths. For this reason, this is not a fight against the terrorism. And in case, if you are fighting against terrorism, you do not have a right to sweep all your population to the border of Turkey, which means still 4 million people is living inside Turkey, and you are forcing 2 million extra people to the border of the Turkey. So this is not acceptable from the point of perspective of the Turkey. And I do believe, as a security expert, that there is no Syrian Arab army. There are Iranian-supported militias on the ground and the Russian air support. Other than that, there is no Syrian Arab army which is fighting against with its people. For this reason, Turkey is not supporting any armed groups. The only interest that Turkey is dealing with now to keep and to prevent those 2 million people who is approaching to their borders. And Turkey...
Okay, Yusuf, let me ask you this. Are Turkish forces prepared to take on Syrian forces directly in the Aleppo area?
From my point of perspective, Turkey has no intention to fight with the Syrian Arab army inside Aleppo, inside Laskiye and Damascus. Turkey has only one political goal: to prevent the refugee flow to its country's border. As I said, there are already 4 million Syrians who is living inside Syria, and that is a pure demographic and ethnic cleansing of these people around this region. For this reason, extra 2 million will create definitely an economic problem, social problem, and also at the same time, a demographic change, not inside the Syria, but in the cities of the Turkey.
Okay, let me go to Dmitry Babich in Moscow. Dmitry, Turkey and Russia are on opposing sides of this conflict, but they're also engaged in talks to try and de-escalate the situation. In fact, some of those talks are taking place in Moscow on Monday. What can those talks achieve?
Well, when you say that Turkey and Russia are on the opposing sides of the battle in Syria, you are basically repeating the mantra of the mainstream media in the West. And unfortunately, the mainstream media in the West gets things wrong. You know, they repeated thousands of times that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That didn't make it the truth. The same story with Russia and Turkey in Syria. Russia, of course, supports Syrian territorial integrity, and we support the Syrian government because it's a member of the United Nations, and no one has suggested a better government. There were no elections that would elect a new government in Syria. But we acknowledge that Turkey has serious security interest on the border with Syria. Turkey is our friend, and we're not going to just cut communications and make ultimatums. Unfortunately, the West has lost its diplomatic ability. If you look at the so-called diplomacy from the West, they stopped diplomatic relations with Damascus. They are now not having a real dialogue with Turkey. They insult the Turkish president all the time. So the difference between Russia and the West is that we talk to everyone, and we try to avoid insults. Just because you call the Syrian government a regime, it doesn't mean that Syrian people will support it less, you know. This is a fact. If Mr. Assad had been so terrible, if no Syrian people supported him, if there was no Arab Syrian army, he wouldn't have withstood the rebellion against him, which was supported by Saudi Arabia,
Dmitry,
by Jordan, by Qatar, by the United States, by many outside players. So Russia's position is compromise, and I will finish very quickly. We want Syria to have a government elected by the Syrians. That's why we support a constitutional commission, some commission that would bring together the Syrian opposition and the Syrian government. But certainly, terrorists need to be removed from Idlib. The organizations like Jabhat al-Nusra, Tahrir al-Sham, which are openly operating in Idlib, they should leave Idlib. Don't forget that Mr. al-Baghdadi was killed in Idlib. How can the United States continue calling it rebels?
Okay,
you know?
Dmitry, very quickly, so what are these talks going to achieve? If, as you say, Turkey is an ally of Russia, and so is the government of Bashar al-Assad, what are those talks going to achieve, very quickly?
There is one point that we have in common, that the terrorist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, Tahrir al-Sham, and others, they need to be removed from Idlib. Turkey promised to do it. The agreement in Sochi presupposed that Turkey would do it. If Turkey does it, if it fulfills its part of the job, there will be no problem at all between us. On the other side, we are ready to patrol together with Turks the disputed areas, the insecure areas, and, of course, Turkey and the Syrian government and Russia, we want American troops out of Syria. Don't forget that Mr. Trump openly said that he took Syrian oil. I took the oil. No one gave him that oil. He has no right to be there, taking other countries' oil.
All right, I've got to move on. Edmund, many countries involved in this conflict. We have Syria, Turkey, Russia, Iran, and even the United States has a contingent there, ostensibly looking after Syria's oil reserves, protecting it, as they say. What are the risks of escalation?
I think the risks are real, and this could easily mushroom into a conflict, a much larger, much wider conflict. And as we heard from your guests, this shows the complexity, as you pointed out, of this conflict, because there are too many parties that have vested interests in what's going on. on the ground. And I think the changes that have been taking place recently are putting pressure on these different parties. The Syrian military has made, with the support of Russia, with the support of Iran, has made significant gains recently, particularly in its efforts to control two strategic highways. What we have seen so far is that they control the road M5, which is links Damascus with Aleppo. It has been very difficult to do so. This is very important. This was also one of the conditions, one of the Sochi agreement. The second thing is that M4, there are efforts also to regain control of that road, which would link Latakia on the Mediterranean with Aleppo. Aleppo is the second capital of Syria. Yeah. Also, the Syrian army has moved into much closer. They now control about a third of Idlib, maybe a little bit more than that. So that is very significant, and that is worrisome. Right. To some of the other parties that had different interests, different visions of what they would like to see in Syria, and that's including Turkey, right, including the United States, and that's what makes it so complex.
As you say, significant gains as the Syrians try to maintain the territorial integrity of the country, but what do you make of President Erdogan's warning that they will push back Syrian forces in the Idlib?
Well, that's what makes it so, in fact, dangerous. We have to see, is Turkish president really willing to do that? Because he knows that sooner or later this will lead to a conflict with the Syrian army, which is much more professional, much more experienced. It has been fighting for 10 years. And so that is one. But also there's Russia there, there's Iran. There's also the United States. The question is, there have been attempts. The United States has recently come out. The president has talked with President Erdogan, President Trump. There were also statements from Secretary Pompeo and the envoy to Syria, Jeffrey, saying that they considered Turkish soldiers who were killed in some of the recent confrontations as martyrs. The question is, will the United States be willing to fight alongside Turkey's side? And this brings us back to what happened when the Russian plane was shot down by the Turks, and Turkey had hoped that NATO would intervene. NATO will not intervene if Turkey is attacking, but it would intervene if Turkish territory and Turkish forces were attacked inside Turkey.
It could invoke the NATO doctrine of collective self-defense?
Not when they are on the offensive.
Right. Yusuf, I know you wanted to respond to that very quickly, please.
Let me say that Turkey didn't opt any help from the NATO countries officially, because Turkey knows that since from 1963, a Johnson letter has arrived to Turkey that Turkey will not be helped by NATO against the Soviet Union. From that moment on, Turkey never trusts to NATO and also to the United States, and also do not trust to any country surrounding it. But let me tell you one word that my counterpart said that Turkey will not be able to fight with the Syrian Arab army. That is ridiculous with any expert who is dealing with military analysts. That is uncomparable forces on the ground that Turkey will fight definitely both with the Syrian Arab army and the Iranian militias on the ground if the deal is not reached today.
Okay. Mohamad Ali, you've heard all those very disparate views there on what is going on in that part of Syria. What can Syria do about a large Turkish presence in that part of Syria? I mean, is it inevitable that Turkey will want to maintain the buffer zone that it's been talking about along the border with Syria, and will Syria just have to live with that?
Well, what is very clear is that the Syrian army will fight back. This is what the Syrian army is doing, actually. We have seen that there were several Turkish soldiers killed. Most of the observation posts, the Turkish observation posts in Syria, the 12 observation posts which were established in accordance with the Astana deal, most of them are actually now surrounded fully by the Syrian army. And allow me also to respond to your guest, Yusuf. First, he said, and he claimed that there is no such thing as a Syrian army on the ground. There are only Russians and Iranians. But then, in reply to your question, if the Syrian army will take on the Syrian army, if the Turkish army will attack the Syrian army, he said he doesn't believe so. So he's contradicting himself. Also very clear, if we hear the statements by the Syrian army command on the ground, we always listen that the Syrian army is making it very clear that troops on the ground are fully prepared to respond to the Turkish attacks and the terrorist attacks, meaning that the Syrian army regards Turkish presence inside Syria as an occupation force. At the end of the day, Astana deal does not give the right to Turkey to get 1,500 armored vehicles with troops to inside Syria. At the end of the day, those Turkish military reinforcements are going directly to the so-called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is led by the al-Nusra Front. Let's also take into consideration that Turkey has opened, since the start of the crisis in Syria, all of its borderline, and about 800 kilometers, to all of the terrorist groups who want to enter Syria and to all of the weapons that they want to bring in. Turkey has played a very, very significant role, negative role, in the crisis in Syria. It has helped all kinds of armed groups inside Syria. And if we look at the ground, we can see that Turkey regards those armed groups as an investment. It is losing its investment at the end of the day, and this is why it has been rushing and threatening the Syrian army that it will carry out a military operation unless the Syrian army withdraws from Idlib by the end of this month. But allow me, give me just 10 seconds. At the end of the day, the Syrian government is Russia's main ally. Russia will not allow Turkey to attack the Syrian army.
Dmitry, over the weekend, Russia came in for some...
This is the reality.
Okay, Yusuf, I'll get to you in a moment. Let me go to Dmitry. Dmitry, Russia came in for some criticism over the weekend from President Trump, who said that Russia must stop its support for what he termed Syrian atrocities. But explain this to us, spell it out for us. Why is Russia so committed to supporting the Assad government?
Well, the Russian and Iranian forces are the only forces, foreign forces, present on the Syrian territory legitimately, because there are two ways in which foreign forces can legitimately enter a sovereign country. You are either invited by the government, or you are authorized to enter this country by the UN Security Council. The Russian aviation was invited by the Syrian government in 2015 when the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS, was expanding, despite having been bombed for 11 months by the American and European aviation. The so-called Islamic State kept expanding. In 2015, it became a threat not only to Damascus, not only to Syria, but don't forget, it's just an hour drive from our border in Chechnya and Dagestan, the two autonomous republics which had Islamist rebellions in the 90s. So Russia was defending itself, and it was defending the world when it entered the fighting in Syria in 2015. And yes, we want Syria to be ruled by Syrians. It doesn't mean that we support 100% the Syrian government. You can look at the statements from our foreign ministry. There was some criticism of President Bashar al-Assad, but we don't think that the United States or Europe or someone else from outside should decide who should be Mr. Assad's replacement. That's why we supported the negotiation in Geneva, the negotiation in Astana, ways to start a political process in Syria. The problem is that the West understands this political process very primitively. They just say, Assad must go. They have been saying it for many years, and this was one of the primary reasons for the war.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Assad, whatever you think about him, controls 90% of the country. And when the West is not helping, when the West is blocking humanitarian aid to all of these 90% of the Syrian territory, the West is behaving immorally because it helped start this war. The war continued for almost 10 years, and now the West is blocking the aid to the devastated country. That's immoral.
Edmund, something we haven't talked about, Dmitry just mentioned it, and that is the humanitarian crisis. 800,000 people, in this instance, near the Turkish border, now displaced, now fleeing the fighting. How critical is the situation?
Well, there's no doubt this is a critical situation. There are, as you pointed out, 800,000, maybe more. And there are likely to be even more refugees if the situation continues without a resolution. So there is a real problem. And the difference now is that Turkey, for the first time, is feeling the heat as a result of this, partly because there are about 3 million refugees, maybe a few more.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, I think there's also a response, a reaction inside Turkey. And we saw that its results in the elections that took place in Turkey recently, where the AK party, or the party of the President Erdogan, lost control of cities such as Istanbul and Ankara. Part of the reason for this is because there was criticism of the policy towards Syria, and also resentment of the presence of large numbers of refugees and the rumors about giving citizenships to Syrian refugees. So also this has created problems for Turkey as well with Europe, because the Europeans saw that while they were providing economic assistance to Turkey to keep the refugees, when Turkey felt squeezed, they opened the doors and the refugees went into Europe, and that began to create even internal problems in Europe, especially with the rise of populist parties inside. So the situation became much more complex.
Yusuf, what is the Turkish position on the displaced people inside Syria? As Edmund just pointed out, Turkey is currently giving sanctuary to something like more than 3 million Syrian refugees right now. But what does Turkey want to do with the 800,000 people, if they do cross the border, that are being displaced right now?
That is the biggest question that Turkey does not want to see in the next coming future nearby its borders. That is the reason that Turkey declared to the Syrian Arab regime and to everyone that is the red line from the perspective of the Turkish point. When you take a look at the guest who is addressing from Damascus, never wants to talk about the numbers. I am telling that 11 million of people has been displaced inside Syria, and 6 million of them is living in another country. 4 million of them is living inside Turkey. For this reason, this is not acceptable. Turkey declared for many times he is respectful to the integrity of Syria and respectful to the sovereign state understanding of the Syria. But that does not mean that you will be able to force 6 million of your population to another country by saying that you are a sovereign state and by saying that integrity of Syria. For this reason, the numbers that I am talking cannot be answered by the guest who is talking in the Damascus. This is not fighting against terrorism.
I can answer.
Okay, let me give.
Turkey in any case will not allow the Syrian Arab army to force 1 million extra refugees to inside the Turkish border.
All right, Yusuf, let me give Mohamad Ali a chance to respond to that. Mohamad Ali, there is the question of refugees, and of course there's the broader question of how this war ends, and is President Assad going to be able to put the country back together after so much conflict?
Yes, first of all, regarding the large number of displaced people, whether internally or those who became refugees and left the country, it is true that there are large numbers. But if we look at the reason behind that, it is because countries like Turkey allowed foreign terrorists to attack Syria and to enter. Allow me to speak, please. I didn't interrupt you. Because countries like Turkey allowed thousands of terrorists from over 80 states to enter from its borders into Syria illegally with their weapons and attack civilian areas, residential areas, towns, villages, cities, occupy them and take civilians as human shields. This is the main cause of the large number of refugees and displaced people. This is the main cause. It is countries like Turkey that allowed those terrorists to enter and gave them all of the support, the logistic support. Now we're seeing the Turks fighting alongside the Al-Nusra Front, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They're using their artillery, the tanks, in attacking the Syrian army at the end of the day. So this is definitely why there is a large number of refugees. And also a very important point. Concerns by Turkey about a rising number of refugees does not give it a right to occupy parts of Syria and have over 1,500 armored vehicles enter and also give all the kind of weapons to the terrorists inside. 90% of Idlib is controlled by the Al-Nusra Front, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There were two obligations under the Astana deal that Turkey should have made. First, separate the Al-Nusra Front from the so-called moderate opposition groups, and it failed to do so. Second, create a demilitarized zone with 20 kilometers deep, and it also failed to do so. And this is why we're seeing now the military operation by the Syrian army, which is in implementation of Astana.
All right, Yusuf, I've got very little time left. A quick response from you, please.
Okay, let me tell you that again, he couldn't spell any number. Only said the large numbers because 11 million of the Syrian population is living outside where they were born and 6 million is out of the country. And he's trying to explain this situation because of the terrorist attacks.
Where did you get the numbers from? Where did you get the numbers from?
No, go and read the United Nations report. Do not interrupt me. You go and read the United Nations report.
The United Nations doesn't know how many displaced people inside Syria are.
Do not interrupt me. I didn't interrupt you when you say so. So you should
know. No one knows how many displaced people are in Syria.
Go ahead.
In terrorist-held areas, no one knows because there are only terrorists. No one can count them at the end of the day.
Mohamad Ali, one moment. Yusuf, go ahead.
You do not care about the Syrians.
He's biased.
You do not care about your people. You are killing your own citizens. 11 million people is living at the outside. And no
I'm a journalist. I don't kill anyone.
No one is escaping to Latakia.
Okay.
Everyone is trying to escape Europe. Everyone is trying to escape to Turkey. Do you know why? Because you are using barrel bombs among the top of the people who is innocent, who is living in Aleppo, who is living in Damascus,
not against the people, against the terrorists that Turkey is supporting.
Just the same like the Hafiz Assad in 1970.
Yusuf, one moment. Okay, one moment. Mohamad Ali, you have 20 seconds for a response. I've got to go after that.
The Syrian army, the response is that the Syrian army continues with its fight against terrorist group with the help of Russia, with the help of Iran. Yes, those are legitimately helping the Syrian army. The Syrian army is fighting terrorist groups, mostly the Al-Qaeda-linked, the Al-Nusra Front. At the end of the day, the army is determined to continue with its fight until liberating all of Syria, despite the threats by Turkey or any country supporting terrorists.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. It's been a very informative discussion, as we've just heard. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week, we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists, and others. It's a fresh, focused, and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict, or US politics, the Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find the Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.